Raven told
Good
me
seeing
to.
you.
Raven told me to tell you greetings from the fifth dimension
Absolutely.
as the
That
way to
was,
kind of kick off
yeah,
this little conversation here. Which,
absolutely.
correct me if I'm wrong, that means the fifth dimension is sort of representative of love, right?
hmm
Mm.
Well,
Yeah. So, how you doing after the trail? I know post-trail depression is a real thing, and everyone
yeah, well,
deals with it in their
uh,
own way. How are you dealing with it?
I'm doing well, doing well. I ended up actually moving to Houston, Texas, and
Mm-hmm.
looking for a new marketing position down here. And so I've just been sending out my resume and seeing what can happen. I have a background in marketing, and just felt like it'd be a nice fresh start after the trail down here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and now here we are talking about your declaration of interdependence, which I think is something exciting. I think
Yeah.
everything sort of starts with having a discourse and having conversation. Even no matter how small, it has potential to always grow. And planting that seed with just something as simple as like a little podcast, can
Mm-hmm.
grow over time. Like look at things, Joe Rogan has made and other very influential podcast um, interviewers and whatnot. And so I see here that you've created this new document and you have a GoFundMe for your new declaration. So I think
I
that's
do. I
cool.
do.
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting, and it kind of reminds me of starting the trail too. It's like I don't really know what I'm doing, but
Yeah,
I got my backpack and I got a couple of things I know I'm gonna need, and
yeah, that's
just
it.
gonna give it a shot and see what
That's
happens and
right.
make some
Bear your
adjustments.
burden and just stumble up the hill.
That's right. That's right. You know it.
Yeah,
Yeah. So it's so exciting to have you as my first guest here too. I mean,
yeah.
I couldn't think of a better match here to take
Well,
people into the dimensionality of reality.
yeah. Well, there's something to it. I mean, I don't know. These are just abstract thoughts, that I've
Hmm.
had, while on the trail and just in life of what our reality is made up of, and
Hmm.
um, you know, how that then influences our decisions with things, and
Hmm.
um, I guess a sort of a very loose and abstract view of reality for me is that everything is dimensionally based, and that it's held down with gravity within
Hmm.
space, but it is interdimensionally brought together. And I do believe there's actually some math that you can prove with this. I mean, a good book to look at for dimensionality is the book Flatland, where it sort of takes you through how the first dimension is basically a line, and the second dimension is a square or a triangle or a circle.
Right.
And then three-dimensional objects is what we are. We are three-dimensional objects living and moving throughout a three-dimensional world, and you
Hmm.
can mathematically graph those things. You can have equations to graph those dimensional spaces,
Hmm.
and you can relate that to what we are, and you can mathematically prove, many different dimensions, possibly up to infinity, and that kind of brings sort of an interesting thought to, well, how can you relate that to what we are? And if there are these mathematically proved other dimensions, what do they mean for us, and how can we access them? And are they accessed through death? Is it that right now through life we are limited within our dimensionality? We are limited to our three dimensions, and the fourth dimension being like a tesseract, where it's a three-dimensional object where every face of the three-dimensional object is another three-dimensional object, which can be
Hmm.
sometimes thought of as time. And our brains are constantly going all throughout time. Time, I mean, is, we kind of perceive it as linear, but as we gain new information and things, we're constantly changing our perception of what time is. And that's why we watch movies and we read books, because as we do these various things, when we participate in these stories, we gain new information later on that then changes our view of what happened in the past by gaining new information. So our time is constantly changing for us in our view of it. And With that being said, I don't know how that kind of relates to us, and what that means from a religious standpoint in terms of maybe through sort of conquering death, we then gain access to the other dimensions, and we sort of go back to source, and we kind of go back to the collective consciousness that intertwines us all together, and how there are certain levels of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm going to back up a little bit to the piece about love. I want you to, because it is kind of complicated, and I've heard you try to explain this a couple times now, and I don't always follow exactly right along. But help me understand, like, the point you're making, that the fifth dimension is love. Like, help me wrap my head around that.
Well, I guess if I know this is, I have no experience or background with any of these various things. I'm a nobody, you know. I through hiked the trail, and these are just thoughts that
Not
I
a nobody.
had.
You're
Well,
somebody.
that means a lot. Thank you. But I guess if the first dimension is like a line, and the second dimension is a square or a triangle or a circle, and the third dimension is like a cube, and the fourth dimension is a tesseract, which a tesseract is essentially what we are. We're moving tesseracts throughout this three-dimensional world, which the fourth dimension can sort of be seen as time, and then to mathematically calculate out the fifth dimension, it would essentially, I mean, this isn't concrete, so I can't be like for sure about this, but to me, it sort of seems that the fifth dimension is almost this like tesseracts interlocked. So you're basically like within the fourth dimension, it's a three-dimensional object where every face of the three-dimensional object is another three-dimensional object. To then bring that up to another dimension, it's basically tesseracts interlocked. And so to have complete access to the fifth dimension, it's almost like a holistic true love with everyone constantly at the same time, where we are all constantly interlocked. And I believe we have not the full ability to have that with our current life, with our current sort of boundary of that which we are. I would say that we have somewhat of a breakage between getting into the fifth dimension, which is basically through love, because there is you know, through intercourse. Basically, it's tesseracts interlocked, and when you and so we sort of have, and that's why, like, you know, there's a big importance on sex, and basically on soulmates and soul ties, and how there is something there, you know, there's even perhaps religious implications of what that means, and how, you know, those don't go away once you have those soul ties. It's important because you're breaking into the fifth dimension when you create these soul ties. You're basically interlocking two tesseracts together, which is like sort of what we are. And I don't know, these are all very loose, abstract ideas that I've just had, but I think there is something there when it comes to dimensionality, and that which sort of makes us all up, and how maybe to an extent that is God, basically.
Right.
And I do have a religious belief on things. I personally am Greek Orthodox, which is a denomination of Christianity. And I believe that unlike other denominations of Christianity, Greek Orthodoxy has sort of a different take on things. Whereas with the Trinity, one thing specifically with it is the Trinity. We view the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, as being both independent and the same at the same time. And that is some way sort of a fundamental within quantum mechanics, because if you look at, say, like a quantum computer, and you have like binary code, ones and zeros, a quantum computer is basically able to have a zero be a 0 and a 1 at the same time, and also independent at the same time. And so that's it.
You
And
lost
that,
me
and
on that one.
well, so a computer is, and again, I'm not like these. I could be totally wrong here. I could
Sure.
just be totally speaking
We're
speaking
using
out
our
my
imagination
ass.
now.
This is like these are like very just abstract ideas. Like very little knowledge of this, but from my little understanding of these things, computers at its basic level is code. And at the most basic level, you have binary code where you have
Right.
zeros and ones, action, reaction, and then that brings in actions into the computer, and it creates an interface and so on. And so from my understanding, when it comes to like quantum mechanics, like at the quantum level, physics operates differently. And to have, for an example, like a quantum, computer, you're able to do a lot of operations a lot quicker because of the fact that, from my understanding, which could be completely wrong, you're able to have like a code like a zero be a 0 and a 1 at the same time, while also being independent at the same time. And so I guess relating that back to Greek Orthodoxy, whereas with like the Catholic faith and other different denominations, they view the Trinity as either being like the same, they are the same, or they're separate. But something interesting within Greek Orthodoxy is we believe that they are the same and separate at the same time. And
Right.
relating that to what we are as humans, and like what sort of we are when we pass our lineage down through our kids, it's like you are your father, you have the DNA of your father, and the blood that runs through you is sort of the same. You and your father are different individuals. You are both independent, but you are both the same at the same time. You are you, and your father is your father,
Right.
and there's the blood that runs through you. But at the same time, while you are both independent, you are both also the same because of the DNA and the blood that runs through you. And to what that means in terms of all of us as a whole, I think it maybe means that it's not necessarily reincarnation, but it is that we truly are our ancestors. We truly are our ancestors. We are sort of, the God to an extent. Like we are God. And it's, I guess, it's all about vernacular, which that's another aspect that I'd like to, I guess, talk about is
Sure.
when it comes to, when it comes,
really you helped me understand while I was out there is that there's so many different ways to describe certain things,
right.
and if you don't
Well,
use those
because
words to describe it wholly, like for example, when you brought up when you read the Declaration of Interdependence there yesterday, and you said, "Hey, you need to put God in here," and I said, capital G God. I'm kind of joking with you that like,
well, God, the highest of high is
sure,
is God, and so
sure,
it's like God is, I guess, I don't know, another just sort of abstract idea, but God is like a brain. God is like a brain, and we are sort of I don't know, like the cells that like bring signals up to it. It's like layered. Like we have like a brain, and we have bodies, and we're each these individual, like we're made in God's image. We are each these individual like units, but then as a whole, like we all then make up God. So it's like we are God to some extent. We are God basically evolving to decide which parts sort of progress forward. And that's what it all sort of goes into is the evolution of us. And I again, my like, these are just abstract thoughts.
sure.
I could be totally wrong with this, but I do believe it's there's like a code kind of behind it. Like we are, to an extent, sort of like a simulation. We're God's simulation, and so I hope I'm not saying things inaccurate in regards to these things related to Greek Orthodoxy, because I do have a strong affinity for Greek Orthodoxy, and I do believe that it is very right, and it's something that I'd like to become ever more familiar with, and how the science kind of backs it up. I believe the sciences within physics and quantum mechanics, I believe, back up religion. I believe it's like a circle rather than like a spectrum. I think it's sort of, it spins around in terms of science and religion answering the same questions, but just with like a different vernacular, because it's all about vernacular. Vernacular is the local dialect that we all use. Vernacular is originated in our geographic region and our cultural upbringing. So we have these spoken words that mean these things. And so you say the word like God, and you then picture all these things in your mind based on your cultural upbringing and your geographic region that then defines God in your mind. And if you have a certain view of God that maybe is contradictory to like what society and other things are saying, then you might find yourself in disbelief of what God is. But I think that is kind of on your part to dig a little deeper and understand what is the true vernacular of religion. What is the true vernacular of God? What are the truths to these things, and how that's all essentially defined? Because the Bible was originally Hebrew, Greek, and so on, and then over many translations later, we have all these different languages in which the Bible and other religious texts are now read in, and that, as we read these texts, brings a certain picture into our mind of what that is. And if the translation maybe isn't accurate, that could leave us to disbelieve faith and whatnot. But I think it's almost like we have to think more abstractly. We have to think farther than just what our limited language is, our limited vocabulary. We have to think much more abstractly to the, I don't know, the intertwining aspects of our reality, whereas is like God is what reality is. That is, what is ultimately real, and then you have that which opposes it. It's like the yin and yang of it all.
Right. I want to back up to the vernacular thing for a minute here, because you kind of helping explain that to me and the importance of that really helped me to understand how to explain these concepts to other people and how to better understand them myself. So let's think about it this way. In order to have an idea about something, first you have to be able to imagine it. And then you have to have the pieces in place in order to imagine it. So it's like, if you don't have the words to describe something, then you can't really imagine it, right? So it's like stacks on top of each other,
Absolutely, yeah.
And then from that, you can have a conception of something, and then once you have a conception of it, it becomes real. It's like it's real in the concept, and then you can test the concept. And then if the concept works, if it proves to be true, well, then you have something that's real and true, and then you can build a foundation on that, and you can use that for whatever your purpose is. Absolutely.
Which I think that it's an interesting thing, and it's like okay, with all that then defined, what's your purpose in it? And I don't know. Your purpose is just to bear your burden, to bear your soul, to be true to yourself. And I think that's what Jesus showed us. Jesus showed us, he was probably the coolest guy out there. He was so cool that people wanted to kill him because they weren't able to bear their burden and be true to themselves the way he was. Right. I think that's sort of, it's like, it's kind of like the Matrix, it's like there's this code that brings everything together, and Jesus being more directly from source, being of direct source to the Most High God, he was able to see the code behind it all, and he and be able to bear his burden and be more true to himself than anyone else. And because of that, people would hate him for it, because he was so true to himself. He was so he was able to bear his burden so well and be so calm, and that there is scriptures about him getting angry, but even within anger, that's a level of being true to yourself and just the emotions that you show. And I think the more true to yourself you get, and the more you bear your burden, the higher you sort of get, and the more you're able to sort of see the underlying code of the universe, and then kind of navigate your way successfully through it. And success is all relative as well. Like, what is success, and this and that and the other. and that's kind of for you to define, but is it like, are you being true to yourself? Are you bearing your burden? And are you able to have peace with things?
Right.
And to live, to create. The purpose of life is to create, and you create yourself. To create yourself, you create yourself through art, through kids, through your job, through envisioning what it is that you want to be in the future, and then obtaining that. It's through creating yourself, through doing that. The purpose of life is to create. So it's
and that kind of makes me think of the Darwinian aspects of all these things, because I've been a fan of Darwin for a long time, and
absolutely.
I think that's all embedded in all these things, right? It's like everlasting life. It's like, this isn't we're not talking about a place in the sky where it's like a retirement home where you go and everyone takes care of you and everything's Gucci. It's like no. It's like it's Darwinian everlasting life. It's like if you do well here and bear your burden and love, and then you create a family, and that family creates a family, and that family creates a family, and that's goes into infinity essentially, going forward. And that's how we've arrived at our present place, is that people have done that before us, and we are them. Like you indicated there.
Absolutely.
I also want, building off that Darwinian point, I like to I want to back up to the fourth dimension and kind of discovering the fourth dimension, which I think is sort of alluded to there in Genesis and the Adam and Eve story, after eating the forbidden fruit, and they kind of wake up. The scales are lifted from their eyes, and they kind of like see the future. They become aware of their vulnerabilities and become aware of the danger that kind of lurks in the future. And that happened. There was a time, maybe not a specific point in time, maybe it was like a slow process over thousands or tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years, where we realized, hey, our problems today are also problems tomorrow and problems next year. And it was a realization that changed our evolution forever, and I'm wondering if a similar thing is going to happen, like with what you're talking about, or maybe it's already happening and we just don't realize it yet. Maybe it's not the single point in time, but it's discovering the fifth dimension, whatever that is. It's like, is that where we are? Is that where we're ultimately destined to do?
Well, I do think that there is a beginning and there is an end, and science can even show us that with Big Bang and the eventual end of everything. And I think that is actually rooted within religious definings as well, of there being a beginning and there being an end. And what that means, and I'm not entirely sure. I think that's where one must just have faith and further try to research and learn to be a better person and progress, and whatever that might mean for you.
Right. I want to talk about this word faith too, and come back to the vernacular surrounding that term, because there was a time where I would think that someone having faith was sort of a naive thing, like, oh, you believe in something that's not true and you're basing your life on that, and it's like going to lead you into maybe even making mistakes or doing things that aren't correct, and I think I've come to a different sort of understanding now, and it's something along the lines of like faith is necessary because uncertainty is inevitable.
Right. Faith is bearing your burden. Faith is bearing your burden, and it is being true to yourself, and it is a humility. That is what faith is, I believe, and through that, I believe you can progress. And that is what I believe Jesus showed us. I believe that Jesus ultimately, he showed us follow yourself. He showed us follow yourself, be true to yourself, bear your burden.
Yeah. And then I also want to back up to the thing where you talked about people hating Christ. I think that's an interesting thing, because if we talk about Christ symbolically as like the ideal man or the ideal person, then really what people are hating is like the gap between where they sit and the ideal,
Right.
that space
Absolutely.
between there, like all the potential that they're not living up to and the frustration
Mhm.
that creates.
Yeah.
That's where hate comes from. It's like a recognition of that you're falling short of what you could be, and you're
Mhm.
fulfilling your potential. And I think
Yeah.
it's certainly not good to have that, but it's sort of normal too. It's like it's frustrating to realize that you're failing in some ways, falling
Right.
short in some ways.
Absolutely.
You know?
Well.
Yeah. So you think maybe we'll eat some sort of psychedelics and recognize fifth dimension, just like our
Yeah,
ancestors?
I mean
Maybe.
that's a good. I mean that's an interesting point, because I think there was like a university like in Israel that did research on the burning bush that Moses encountered in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and they think that it's possible that might have been some sort of psychedelic, and and you know the implications of taking psychedelics and what that means, and what that means with like a religious vernacular.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know but there's something there to that. There's something
Right.
there. Are you sort of accessing other dimensions when you take certain psychedelics? And I'm not
Yeah.
sure. It's
Or
interesting, because
the word
one
accessing, just to kind of come back to the vernacular thing,
yeah
the word accessing I think is interesting, because the way I see it is more, are you able to turn off certain things that you see in order to
mhm,
see things that you normally don't see?
yeah
Like it's almost like we're adapted, going back to the Darwinian sense of things. Like originally we were adapted for 3 dimensions in order to survive in those 3 dimensions. And then we realized time was also a dimension that we needed to worry about. So we became
right
adapted to also understand time,
hmm hmm
and maybe that process was accelerated through, the stoned ape theory, essentially,
right right
and
well it's
progress that further. And do we need psychedelics to progress that further? Or is it something that we have within us that we can do? And how does this
mhm,
all tie into like where we are in the state of social political affairs,
mhm.
and how that changes our evolutionary trajectory?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
It's interesting. There's a lot to be researched, and there are many who are researching it, and it'll be interesting to
Hmm.
see where things continue to go.
Hmm. Yeah, and like we said with the fractals, like it just goes forever. It's like it just
hmm It's
there's no bottom.
layered. We're layered within it.
Right. There's no bottom to it. If you think you've hit the bottom, you've only just begun. Right. It's deep.
Right.
And
hmm
and
All I
uh,
know is nothing. Right, like Plato
yeah.
says. All I know is nothing.
Right.
It There's definitely something going on. I definitely have a very strong belief in God, and God being the highest, the most high, and
Yeah. I want to.
Jesus
I want
being
to.
a real person,
I
and
want
his strength, and his teachings that he provided.
Yeah. So just to kind of bring it back to the vernacular piece with that definition, for me, it's not like God is not this higher order being that like controls everything or anything like that. It's not some old man in the sky. Like I think that's sort of
Mhm.
ridiculous, and that's sort of part of the reason that I was atheistic for most of my life, right? But now,
That's sort of like a Santa Claus
sure,
commercialized version.
right, and that's the discussion that we had with Strikeout once upon a time too, right?
Mhm.
And now what I've kind of the vernacular that I find useful is thinking it more of as a higher order principle, you know,
Mhm.
like the principles that are true and useful, and you
Mhm.
can almost make the analogy of like chess, because we played a little bit of chess, and Raven's been beating me. She's got a lot
Yeah,
better. I don't want to get
that's
too
good.
sidetracked here. She's been beating me.
It's
She's
that well,
gotten very
that's
improved,
good. She's very smart.
But
That's
anyway, it's like there's principles in that game,
hmm
and it's like there's an infinite number of variations of moves that you can make, and how the game can kind of unfold, right? But
yeah.
there's definitely bad moves that you can make, and there's
hmm
definitely good moves that you can make, and like,
Missing the mark. Missing the
right,
mark.
right, and
Well, I
there is a higher order principle, right? And
mhm.
and that's real and it's true, and what is that principle, right? It's like I don't know, but the truth is definitely part of it, right? It might even be the most important part of it, because it's the foundation of everything else, right? If you're building things on lies, then you're not doing yourself any favors, and whatever you're working on is doomed to collapse anyway, you know?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. It definitely is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The answers are there and the truth is there. It's sort of like piecing it together and understanding our role within it. I hate to cut this short, but my computer is actually on 1%, and it might die any minute here.
Okay. Well, we got a good half hour in here, so I think it was a good launch to the podcast here. Mostly we just talked about dimensionality and vernacular around religion and stuff. But
shoot the breeze, getting
I would
going.
like to, when we have more time here in the future, dive into the Declaration of Interdependence and maybe hear some of your ideas about how we might change the structure of our social political system to better serve us and now and into the future. You know, so
absolutely
think on that, and we'll talk again soon. Oh, I think you finally died. Love you, brother. Talk to you soon.